Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you with us in our next installment of the Chief Architect Network Live. Joining me today, myself, Grant Ecker, and my guest, Ranghan, the CEO of the Rezilyens family of companies, and most notably, Pinnacle.ai. We're going to be talking about some pretty exciting things today. But first, for those of you who haven't joined us before, a little bit about our group. We are the Chief Architect Network. And what we are is really a gathering of Fortune 500 scale Chief Architect Network Chief Architect executives. Pardon me for that. And what we are is we're global. So we're about 230-ish people in the US, around 70, 80, almost 100 in Europe, and the balance of our 366 members across Asia Pacific, India, Middle East, and Africa. It's a growing group, and together we widen perspectives, share best practices, grow as leaders, develop our talent, and drive outcomes. For those of you potentially interested in this, you can follow us on both YouTube and LinkedIn. And if you are a chief architect, somebody who's leading an organization of architects by 10 or more is roughly the math we use, or if you are the senior most architect of a Fortune 500 scale company, apply to join us. Go to chiefarchitectnetwork.com. It's a great way to get engaged. Throughout the show today, you can ask a question at any time. Just type it in the chat. And for those of you that are in the actual network with me, about half hour into this, you can log in and actually join the show for live Q&A. So that is a little bit about who we are and what we're doing. I'd love to just take a minute and introduce you to my friend and colleague, Ranghan. Ranghan, so glad to have you with us today. Would you mind telling the group a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Grant, first, thank you for having me. Love the opportunity to discuss this in your forum. Architecture is very close to everything that we do. Obviously, running a company means being in the details. And, with respect to Pinnacle, since we're talking about cybersecurity and AI, in the end, it's about next-gen architecture. And what we're really going to hopefully address in this conversation is about how should we future-proof systems, which means that what does the future-proofing architecture basically look like in the day where cybersecurity appears to be elusive? Companies are spending millions of dollars, yet are not able to close the last mile gap. What could be that architecture? That's really what this is about.
Absolutely. Well, let's pull up our little agenda to kind of have that in mind. So from weakness into weaponry in the AI quantum age. Well, what a powerful statement, Ranghan. Maybe just unpack that a bit for us a bit. What does that mean to go from weakness into weaponry?
To start with, it's about playing to win in an uncertain world. That's really what it is. And this really comes from the concept of anti-fragility. This was a term that I didn't invent, but Nicholas Taleb talked about it in his book called Anti-Fragility. In fact, anti-fragility is not even a term in the English dictionary, but it's a term that he coined to basically explain the anecdote to fragility. Resilient systems essentially resist shocks. They stay in the game. But an anti-fragile system essentially gets stronger with each hit. They thrive in chaos, using every setback as a fuel for improvement. For an anti-fragile system, stressors, shocks, volatility, all these aren't threats, they're opportunities for growth. When we talk about the next-gen architecture, what we are really talking about is how do we essentially use this as a property that sort of leverages disorder to sort of come back stronger. It is the opposite of fragility, where an entity doesn't just thrive disruption, but actively improves because of it.
Oh, it's a really cool concept. And I think I can get it, right? I guess one of the things I'm curious about, though, is what if one of those hits is too big? Like, what if one of those hits is, something that actually starts to damage or cause some kind of downtime? How is that viewed in this kind of mindset?
So, in short, right? I mean, there are many. We'll have to unpack it in many layers.
Okay.
First order of business is to say that we are going to thrive in uncertainty, which means that chaos and uncertainty has to become a natural absorber. An organization should become an absorber of that. where you're transforming a defense strategy from passive protection to active evolution. Rather than relying on fixed barriers, anti-fragile cybersecurity systems actually learn from each threat. They turn the attacks into opportunities for adaptation. In other words, it's like your immune system. Just like when you vaccinate yourself, your immune system is activated. You're talking about a similar immune system to an enterprise architecture that can become anti-fragile. It's a mindset that revolves around not avoiding risk, but about strategically using risk to enhance defenses. That is the foundation. So you're talking about a next-gen architecture principle that translates into a non-obvious high-impact strategy to protect companies.
I love the immune system analogy. I mean, to me, that makes sense. How many times have I been totally knocked out? Very few, but still, you come back stronger. Your body now has had that disease and it knows how to handle it. What a great metaphor.
Exactly. So you treat adversity. So the first principle here is learning from adversity. Attacks as catalysts for system evolution. So you treat adversity as a source of improvement. Rather than just bouncing back to baseline, they adapt and strengthen from every shock, becoming better than the baseline. Instead of merely recovering in this architecture, you're basically going to analyze every threat, pattern, entry points, attacker behavior. This is about being highly data-driven, where you are refining threat detection and response algorithms. For instance, by treating each attack as a rehearsal and adapting your machine learning models, making them faster is an important thing. So the insight here is even a minor intrusion attempt are logged, they're analyzed, enabling the system to detect and anticipate similar tactics across different parts of your security layer. It could be network, it could be infrastructure, it could be application. This continuous feedback loop improves the ability to recognize, respond, and adapt proactively. So that's your first principle.
That's fantastic. Let's also just take a minute and welcome our audience as we engage in this conversation. Don't hesitate. Just put a comment into LinkedIn or YouTube to ask a question live, or simply share your thoughts. We'll feature those comments below as we navigate the conversation. So as we start to unpack this, Ranghan, one of the things that you kind of wanted to touch into, which I think is a great place to start, which is the quantum shift and the concept around outpacing AI attacks. How does that quantum shift play into this space, and how can we outpace something that might be really actually a significant change in the security posture of the entire world? What are your thoughts there?
So first and foremost, in the quantum shift, what you're really referring to is how quantum computing continues to change the game.
Right.
Where traditional cryptographic techniques may look outdated. In anti-fragility, so basically anti-fragility is the principle. Quantum is how you get it done. Mm-hmm. And this is where you sort of flip the challenge into a strength. So first and foremost, within the embedded anti-fragility concept, a quantum resistant network structure could essentially be the foundation, where they use each encounter to refine encryption, compartmentalize data, and with each attempt, you're looking at the learning process. So in this, you can imagine an encryption protocol that gets smarter every time it's attacked, adjusting itself to real time. This forces attackers to find new angles, which ultimately makes systems much more stronger. So you're both the defender and the attacker to analyze different angles. Quantum technology here can also help us map out sophisticated threat patterns that traditional methods may not be able to. Each anomaly can teach us, how to recalibrate this to focus on the unpredictable future threats. Quantum is non-negotiable going, into this. Let me give you some more examples. If I take industry examples, say JP Morgan Chase is now actually working on a quantum safe encryption model called the quantum key distribution, QKD as it's referred to, that will allow secure communications to happen and adapt to each quantum attack attempt. So now you're talking about attack attempts that are AI scale. Now you're talking about ones which are quantum AI scale. That's what you're talking about.
And for some of our listeners, they might be more, not as familiar with the quantum threat. And the concept here is around the current, even military grade level of encryption is something that takes years, if not decades, to start to actually decrypt through a brute force mechanism. And quantum computing changes that into days and in some cases minutes. And China just recently was able to decrypt military grade encryption as a proof of concept just in recent weeks. So this is a very real thing. So as Ranghan's talking about building sort of responses to these threat vectors and learning from it, it's a little bit of context. Ranghan, anything you might add in terms of just the context of the quantum threat?
So, I can add it more in the form of examples, which may actually be easier for anyone to comprehend. So if I take quantum safe cryptography as an example, that help secure, say, electronic health records, EHRs. Now with dynamic encryption, we can sort of shift this where we are able to assess patterns, guarding it against future, sort of quantum threats. When you apply the technology directly into protecting EHR, for example, which is an important aspect because, there's a lot of compliance around healthcare. So, however, in this, when you combine anti-fragility, so when you take an anti-fragility as the foundation of the why, the how, is about how do you leverage quantum to become a defensive tactic. So today what's happening is the attackers leverage AI and quantum to whatever extent to decrypt, for example, advanced encryption algorithms. Now, the game has become how you use technology against technology. So if I take Verizon, they use quantum to analyze vast data flows in real time, sophisticating, basically looking at sophisticated attack patterns and sort of adapting their defense to meet increasing challenges that they face because of the networks that they're dealing with. So that is another example of where it is headed. Quantum resistant encryption, for example, is going to become the standard in high risk industries.
Absolutely.
Especially in finance and healthcare. But it won't be cheap or simple. Companies will need lots of resources, specialized skills to keep up with this. Now, quantum combined with AI is going to get even more interesting because it's going to increase the magnitude at which they're sort of going to come together. Most encryption algorithms today are going to become obsolete in the next couple of years, which means that we are not just talking about flipping the script, but actually rewriting the script. Quantum is going to show up faster than we can imagine. It is going to be very analogous to a Big Bang disruption. When you look at the technology adoption curve, you're talking about technology that starts by adoption by innovators, then by early majority or early adopters, going to early majority, late majority, and laggards. Now, quantum is still in the innovator bucket, but I won't be surprised it suddenly shifts all the way like what happened with generative AI into late majority. Yeah. That's how rapidly things are going to change, especially in cybersecurity.
I completely agree. And if you go, I think Gartner might be underestimating a bit. They're calling the quantum ready phase the late 2020s into 2029 being the moment you have to be fully deployed. I think that might be too late. Once we see this technology actually in action decrypting live what is secure today, I believe the world will react exactly as you say, Ranghan. I think it's going to be an absolute shift, a quantum shift per se.
Exactly. Now, I mean, while that is, I mean, still coming, one of the reasons for talking about the other principles related to anti-fragility is, at least for the audience here, you know, if you have someone listening to it, at one level, it's not very actionable because the world is shifting, and I think we all have to be aware of it. But what is more actionable in my fundamental view, while quantum plays a very, very big role in it in the near future, but even if you want to get ready for it, there are other principles that one can apply with what you have today. Let us say you have a scenario where you know that you're going to get probably quantum attacked. You can be quantum ready without quantum technologies. And the question that really comes here is, how do you turn those vulnerabilities into strategic assets? That is why I was discussing the aspect of anti-fragility, because there are many things in the technology stack today that very many companies don't actually use. So, if you, for example, if you take the example of decoy environments, cybersecurity teams can actually map attacker pathways today by understanding, how these patterns emerge. So to give you an example, it's about how you turn vulnerabilities into real assets. These decoys can actually serve as traps, capturing critical information. I don't see very many companies doing that kind of work today, where they use honeypots or decoy databases that attract attackers. You can actually use your vulnerability entry points to essentially map these attacker pathways. Something you can do today. You don't need quantum technology to do that. So that's an example. Then you can actually use what we refer to as adaptive resilience, where you can continuously adapt to specific stressors that will allow you to leverage AI to learn from patterns. Again, these technologies are available today. Very many companies don't have AI-driven anomaly detection that can monitor normal versus abnormal behavior. If a phishing attack, for example, gets past an initial filter, AI algorithms can rapidly modify for future responses. Those things are technologies that you can do today. So these are things that I don't view as innovator-led. They are usually now in early to late majority, which is about 66% of the population.
It's interesting. Right as you were describing that, Bryce, a fellow colleague in the Chief Architect Network, posted this question around when quantum cryptography will coexist with AI and more conventional algorithms. And actually, a lot of what you were just saying while this was up on the screen kind of addressed what he was asking. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely. They certainly address it. Here's what I'll basically say. When you basically look at this scenario, what I would refer to as a way of this coexistence to happen is, we ought to have actually what we call continuous micro simulations, exposing a system to sort of low level simulated attacks on a regular basis. This is what we do, for example. An example would be that whenever we are monitoring, we also use concentrated red teaming activities that we refer to as micro simulations. This approach creates what we call real-time intelligence that sort of equips the system to, not only the system, but people, process, and technology to respond more effectively to high-level threats. Now, all of this are AI-based.
Mm-hmm.
The quantum aspect really comes from the ability to take large data sets and giving it more compute that is not possible in today's technology. That's really where the difference is. And so that's where I see the coexistence happen. The other is the ability to create very, very fast and continuous feedback loops where each incident sort of reinforces the whole system. A breach does not have to just plug one hole. It strengthens similar vulnerabilities across the network. This is where quantum and AI sort of come together, where these things together use incident response or incident driven reinforcement protocols that learn from the breach to apply the lesson now abstracted across an enterprise.
Nice. Let's dig into some of the other areas that we wanted to talk through. So vulnerabilities, right? Trapping vulnerabilities. How do we outsmart intruders?
Like I said, the best thing that you could really do is starting with honeypots and decoy systems.
Yeah.
Where you can actually use even, you can actually infect, or leave systems vulnerable to an attack. Because at the end of the day, you need to create traps. When you create traps, you are essentially allowing to see which aspects of the entry point does an attacker use. So you can study that behavior, especially in systems and in enterprises or industries where the risk is the greatest. So decoys, honeypots work extremely well to study patterns. So an R&D kind of a lab environment that allows for that kind of study is extremely important, because you're now turning vulnerability into a strength. Because you cannot anticipate what this vulnerability does. To give you one example, let's say you have a real vulnerability. Let's say it is Apache Struts has a vulnerability. Now, make sure you put some mitigating controls on it because you happen to have a zero-day vulnerability. But then you can also mimic that in systems which are controlled by a DMZ, making sure that when that system gets attacked, you know what that pattern would look like and what specific vulnerability would be taken advantage by an attacker. So in each scenario, you're converting this vulnerability into a strength rather than viewing this as passive defense and moving this into active defense. That process, really helps because it allows you to strengthen it. You can also strengthen your use cases because you see what's actually happening to this. So the process of self-attack as well as letting others attack it helps immensely in turning this into sort of an active, proactive model instead of saying, oh my God, I'm going to potentially get caught in this. It's very similar to the immune system model that we refer to.
It's pretty brilliant, though, because I don't think a lot of us think this way. The idea of intentionally putting something out there that an attacker might notice and using their attacks on this honeypot, on this fake set of systems of data to adapt our real systems to be secure from those threat vectors. So it's like even better than having gone through and had chickenpox yourself to now have your body immune to chickenpox. You almost have this surrogate, dummy organism that people think is you, that you can get infected with chickenpox that you can learn from and never have to have the disease. I think that's really neat, this whole adapt, deceive, defend. Are there other things that kind of really play into this that are unique AI tactics that you're really seeing across the industry in this space?
Let me take the energy industry. Let me take Siemens. They use honeypots to attract attackers, targeting their critical infrastructure. We all know how important Siemens is to the energy industry. Mm-hmm. So then they track intruders in these decoys. So Siemens learns specific attack patterns, allowing them to sort of improve their defense. Walmart similarly uses decoy networks, mimicking high-value data to lure attackers. Each intrusion triggers an alert, an adaptation, with decoys sort of evolving to become more complex with each attempt. If I take manufacturing, GE leverages anti-fragile anchors in their supply chain. They deliberately expose IoT devices to controlled threats, gathering information to harden security. So in each of these situations, instead of covering up weak spots, you design them to attract attacks in a controlled way. Every interaction with these anti-fragile anchors provides the insight for you to strengthen the system as a whole. Decoys are not just fake targets. they are dynamic traps. Decoys grow more complex and evolve with each intrusion, adapting the attacker model and behavior, making it really easy to now predict attacks instead of being in a scenario where your defenses are designed to compete with luck.
That's pretty compelling. So I would have thought, as we were talking about this, that these decoys and honeypots were dumb, right? And all the sophistication was monitoring how they work. The idea that they would also be secured and adapting their approach to make an even smarter target that we can learn from is pretty compelling. Have you seen this play out? Where you have examples of maybe where that, a honeypot attack we've learned from and been able to actually sort of introduce a protection against a particular threat vector?
See, in our own case, we have an R&D team that only does that. Nothing else. Your entire job is to dream up different types of attacks, test them out, and you have to learn in the simulation world, because you have these edge cases which may never happen. So you have to differentiate between deterministic and probabilistic. Mm-hmm. Most of this world understands how to work with deterministic types of attacks. But what we are really talking about is probabilistic attacks. So you put a probability on it, and then you work through that probability, just like an attacker would. So you have to have that attacker's mindset in that R&D lab that allows you to constantly set up these models for the different layers of security. And I would say that network-based attacks, there is more today than it used to be. Application attacks are few and far between. So application, if you really look at the security layers, the weakest link is your application. So you should spend a lot more time doing it. Network attacks are well studied. They tend to be, fairly good ones. The human layer is extremely weak. There is more work to be done. Then if I take infrastructure, that, especially if you're dealing with IoTs, a huge target space. Industries which are highly vulnerable tend to be entertainment, healthcare, energy. Highly, highly vulnerable. And for those industries, I think, the goal in all of this would be to set up lab environments that study these patterns. And of course, you have to have algorithms that sort of study these patterns. That's really at the heart of what we do. So that's why I talked about it.
I love that. Also take a moment, any Chief Architect Network members on the call with us today, feel free to join us on the live link. It's the second link in your invite, and that's a good opportunity to come on camera and ask your questions live with Ranghan and I. We'd love to have you join us. One of the things I was able to do just recently was join and actually MC a cybersecurity OT event. It's actually the OT Cybersecurity Summit down in Houston. And one of the things, critical infrastructure, as you mentioned, energy is one of the big focus areas. And we're seeing that all of this IT protection is important because it isn't, we probably remember in Target's breach, the air conditioning system was the way they actually got in. Today, it's the opposite. IT is the entry point into OT systems. A lot of these smart manufacturings and things that we're seeing as Industry 4.0 take shape. OT is the target. They're actually seeking to cause harm to factories and to your operational technology, with IT as the entry point. Are you seeing similar things in how sort of Pinnacle is adapting in terms of protecting those IT assets and creating honeypots and other mechanisms and decoys to learn in the industrial space?
So, the number one thing, I'll peel the onion in different, categories. Today, I'll come to Pinnacle, towards the tail end, but I'll start by saying the reason why IT is a critical threat vector is because of what we call third-party and end-party risk. Today, your risk does not have to necessarily be from your own environment. Third-party risks are huge. Case in point, CrowdStrike, the worldwide outage that happened because when CrowdStrike worked with Microsoft, Microsoft is under a regulation with EU where they are supposed to expose their kernel to other third-party developers. Apple does not have that scenario because of Microsoft's omnipresence in the enterprise world. They're subject to more regulations than Apple is. That is why Apple, did not encounter the same issue that Microsoft encountered. So you have CrowdStrike that was competing for kernel resources from certain versions of Microsoft operating systems that led to these crashes. Now, the same, you can draw parallels to SolarWinds, when SolarWinds was used as an entry point into IT systems. So the case or the point I'm trying to make, along with an attack that happened with Slack, where millions of messages from Disney got exposed, to the world. Slack, essentially there was a vulnerability in Slack that got compromised. As a result, Disney got compromised. There was a vulnerability in SolarWinds that got compromised. As a result, companies using SolarWinds got compromised. There was a vulnerability in CrowdStrike that got compromised. Although it was not a security breach, it was nonetheless an infrastructure breach that brought many, many critical systems down. So what I'm trying to say to you is, today the job of a bad actor is very easy. And if I was a bad actor, here's what I would do. I would go to a popular application, and instead of trying to infect each enterprise, I would just take that popular application, go in, do something bad to it, and as a result, I have infected millions of enterprises all in one go. That's the scenario that you're facing. The actual enterprise IT systems is one layer. It's a lot easier because it is your systems, you have some control over it. But when I trust an EDR system, and when I trust a SIM, or I trust a infrastructure monitoring tool, and suddenly the vulnerability comes from that, that's a huge issue. So case in point, I take Tylenol to reduce my fever. But instead of that, Tylenol comes with some other, infection that gives me cancer. Is that going to help? So I have my fever going down, but I now have cancer. That is at the heart of what's happening today. So in yesterday, I had a LinkedIn post that really talked about the following. What I talked about is, in software, unfortunately, the companies that design software, even mission critical ones, can walk away with a simple apology that traditional infrastructure companies cannot. If a bridge falls, if a big building falls, people are going to be restless and people are going to complain a lot. But software today is not designed with that invisible contract doesn't seem to come alive in software. I think it's time that software is written in a way that the highest protection is guaranteed. Today, you have way too many get out of jail cards for software developers, which means that we've all come to accept that vulnerabilities are the way to go. They're inevitable. We are not talking the language that they are not acceptable. There are ways in which software can be written in a 1000x hardened way that nobody is talking about, nobody is writing about. We are not talking about the invisible contract that every company, including Microsoft, has. Microsoft today has a great monetization model. I write software which is weak security-wise. Then I sell you security tools that you have to pay for. It's a beautiful monetization model. I have built-in weakness in the software, and then I let you fix the weakness with my own software that you have to pay for. it's a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. I have joining me today Bryce, one of my colleagues in the Chief Architect Network and a friend of mine. I'm excited to have you here today, Bryce, and thanks for the question earlier. What's your question or comment for Ranghan?
Grant, thanks for having me here, Ranghan. Really interesting. What I wanted to explore and get your thoughts around is the learning about vulnerabilities. Do you see this, and really the level of granularity, do you see this sort of something local, using something smaller like maybe versatile LLMs, or do you see something like maybe security companies are doing today where they need to feed in a network of these vulnerability reports and then learn from that and then share it like on a larger scale?
Now, that's a good question. So what you're referring to is collaborative intelligence. So, I mean, first order of business, I'll just peel the onion in this following way. First, there are specific principles that every company should follow. Okay. And we can use anti-fragility as that basis. And I can give you the set of principles that I think a company can follow. I just want to make this actionable so that we can talk about it in so many different ways, but in the end, it may not produce much. So I'll tell you what I would do. First is I would learn from adversity. So if I was an enterprise, I would have my cybersecurity be built on learning from adversity, where attacks are catalysts for system evolution. The next thing I would essentially try and do is I would turn and look for ways in which these vulnerabilities turn into strategic assets. To your question about how do I make sure I do it? Now, at a very basic level, very many companies don't even know their assets well. It really starts with even knowing your own assets well, because most companies don't have a really good process to refresh the number of assets they have. They don't have metadata around their own assets. So it's very hard to turn vulnerabilities into strategic assets if that basic principle of not having enough assets is there. Third thing is what I call adaptive resilience, where you turn this into real-time learning and defense shifting. What you're really talking about is how do you build resilient systems? Fourth would be how do I turn risk as intelligence, where you have controlled exposure, like we talked about, decoys and honey pots and whatnot. Then I would say incident-driven reinforcement, where you have each breach become a lesson that you can adapt, just like how militaries use a lot of simulations. As we all know, military uses offensive teams and defensive teams, and you almost have to have the same process. Then, of course, you want to have self-optimizing systems where you are using machine learning at scale to do that work. So that's a key aspect. Then, of course, it's about redundancy. Now, when Delta had this incident, again, I've written about all this in LinkedIn as well, where I said Delta had to own it. Well, I'm not a fan of CrowdStrike or Delta, or neither am I, their enemy in any shape or form. Just to be objective, Delta was the slowest to come back, and it is because their systems are not built for that kind of redundancy. They don't have, a method to, to solve these issues. They run very, very critical infrastructure. And for them to come and blame CrowdStrike and say, because CrowdStrike happened, we went down is complete bull. So many of these companies essentially that run critical infrastructure should plan for these scenarios. And many companies don't even have any basic level of scenario planning. So that's where it is. So if I were to break systems down, you have fragile at the lowest end. Then you have robust, which means that I can withstand some stress. Then I have resilient, which means I can bounce back. Anti-fragility is at the top, where I not only bounce back, but I bounce back stronger.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That answers the question. And where I see you going with this is almost a set of maturity steps that companies can work through. And the one thing I'm wondering about, how do you actually take this stuff and package it for so many companies that are in this legacy mode, that they're way at the bottom of the list and they're wondering, what can we do? So I guess two questions: what can the companies do? And then what can somebody like me do to learn more about this? I mean, I want to catch up on all your posts after this, but yeah.
He's a great follow.
So the number one thing is, see, in our case, we do this for a living, okay, and we do this for a living because we are there's a reason why we exist. From our own perspective, our goal is to ensure that we rewrite the rules that are currently there. I had this conversation even with my team as early as this morning. So I was saying, so for example, we have invented a category called ISOC, which is Intelligent SOC Operations, and we have a platform called Foresight. It's a completely new category. In cybersecurity, you have EDR, which is endpoint detection and response. You have a SIEM, which focuses on security, information, and event management. These are categories that someone at some point created. This particular category, takes the kinds of concepts I'm defining to you right now. What I'm preaching here is what ISOC Foresight has. We are working on securing a number of different patterns on it. And what we are basically doing is we are reimagining what security should look like for today and beyond. So we said, what are the kinds of attacks that are likely to happen 5, 7, 8 years out? How do I build for that now? So everything I described to you are the same principles that have gone into the foundation of Foresight. That's why they're called Foresight, because it's the ability to see ahead and build those patterns for future emerging attacks. That's really at the heart of it. And in addition, talking about how to build redundancy in a way that even when the worst happens, you should still be able to bounce back. Cyber resiliency. And we work with many companies in this, and that's the model we take to them. So there's a passion to really solve the problem as opposed to putting a sheen or a lipstick or a band-aid to it. Today, the solutions are pure band-aid, nothing else. And if I look at Microsoft, as an example, again, we use Microsoft products, and nothing against the company, they're a great company. But there's a fundamental flaw here, which is a fundamental deception to their customers, is that I am going to write weak software. Now you have to defend it by buying my own tools. Why should I trust their tools when you cannot even write good software to begin with? How can I trust their tools to defend it? Makes no sense. So if Satya Nadella was in this call, I'll say, I have no reason to trust your defender tools because you don't write good software to begin with that are secure. Why should defender be any better? I have nothing against them. I even own Microsoft stock. But let's talk about it in the form of facts. That there is a flaw in the business model that is for them and against the consumers. This is how software is written. Software, even the defenders write software that is vulnerable today. That's what we are. That's the movement I want to make sure we are against, and we are for writing secure software.
Ranghan, that was incredibly powerful. And I think it's a reality that we are seeing threat vectors through our software vendors, including those that write software that's intended to defend us. We're kind of coming to a natural close. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience as we start to take this perspective of AI in the quantum age and turning weakness into weaponry?
Exactly. So, to close out, what I'll say is that anti-fragility, here is at one level, at the very basic level, it's preparing for the worst.
Mm-hmm.
But at another level, we want to be able to thrive in uncertainty. That's really what it is. How can enterprises be an uncertainty absorber by actively using each attack, vulnerability, and risk as a tool for improvement to transform defense into a competitive advantage? I think it's an obligation for every CISO to think about how that should happen. It also is an obligation for chief architects. Let me put this very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Today, you cannot be a chief architect or call yourself a chief architect if you do not understand security well, period. If anyone here is calling themselves a chief architect and says security is my weakness, go find a new job. Because this is today, architecture without security being built in is a joke. That means you're not the next gen chief architect. I may be offending some people here, but that's the fact. Because we cannot just meet threats head on. We need to get stronger with each encounter. We need to position the organizations that we represent to not just withstand attacks, but turn them into opportunities for growth. This is a play to win approach, ensures cybersecurity isn't a static line of defense. It's an evolving, intelligent force that's capable of handling whatever comes next.
I love that. What a powerful statement. And honestly, I think it's exactly what we're seeing. Bryce, thank you so much for joining us and coming on to the Q&A section. Appreciate it, my friend. I'll just leave you folks with a couple closing thoughts. So again, thank you for joining our Chief Architect Live event. Ranghan, thank you for the inspiring thoughts. I'm seeing a lot of this when I sit with CISOs and when I sit with my peers. I believe that security mindset, security by design, building patterns and building blocks that we know are secured so we can focus on the bespoke parts of our solutions and we have less real estate to address with a security mindset with each solution we build, and we have consistent building blocks is something that's super important inside of the architecture profession in partnership with security. For those of you that are interested in our network, you can follow us here on YouTube and LinkedIn. And if you are a chief architect, please apply to join us, chiefarchitectnetwork.com. If you're interested in connecting with Ranghan after the show, here's his LinkedIn. You can also just click his little button, should be beneath the show today. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about Pinnacle, you can go to pinnacle.ai. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, team. Thanks, everyone. Bye.